Thank you for your participation. And before we get started formally, I wanted to say a couple of things, that it is my take that this panel and the subject of this panel is the most important panel. Not that other panels were not important, but it's nice to do things, but you don't do one-offs. You've got to have follow-up. And in this panel, we're going to hopefully come up with solutions and recommendations on how to follow up. So I guess I should sit down with the rest of the panelists, and I guess we can get started. Okay, let me... My name is Walker Williams. I'm with Leadership Africa USA. And we were given marking instructions on how they would like us to frame our presentation this morning. And I've got a distinguished panel here, and I'm not going to try to do justice to their resumes, but I'm going to let them introduce themselves and their organizations and talk about what they feel is important in their work as the first round while we get into the discussions. Now, but I am going to give them a few suggestions, that we talk about what they do and what their work is and going forward in the context of those priority issues that are affecting the continent. First and foremost, of course, is in the context of education. You know, health. We got this Ebola crisis is confronting us, and it looks like it's continuing and spreading. We want to talk about capacity development. We want to talk about trade and AGOA. So I don't want it to be a wide-ranging introduction, but I want it to be a purposeful introduction. And we also want to follow up on the Leaders Summit, which took place last month. We also want to follow up on the U.S. Africa Energy Ministerial, which took place in Ethiopia. I mean, if you're doing education, if you're doing anything in the continent, you can't do it in the dark. So, I mean, electricity is so critical to all the things we're talking about that I want to make my first statement in saying that everything is related to everything. Now, a little bit about me. My name's Walker Williams. I am president of Leadership Africa USA, and Leadership Africa started off in South Africa working in education. And we started off back in 1992. And at that time you had Bantu education. I made it my mission and business to try to change that system, and I did. They had 17 systems, now they're down to 3. But after working on that, and that education in Africa is still going forward, I realized that there was another critical issue confronting Africa, and that is leadership. So 8 years ago, I changed my focus here in the United States and set up a focus on leadership training under Leadership Africa USA, and we've been working on that ever since in several African countries. Without getting to all the things that we're doing, we are involved in climate change. We're doing a big conference in Ethiopia next month on climate change, which is a very topical conversation right now given the United Nations last week. We just finished that energy ministerial I mentioned. We've done a little bit of work on the Leaders Summit leading up to the Leaders Summit, but the most important thing that I want to leave you with that we have been pushing for the last 2.5 years is to get the African ambassadors involved in our decision-making and put forth their frame of reference on what they want to see accomplished. And we did put out, with all of the African ambassadors, their take on what they want to see in a reauthorized AGOA. And that has been a consensus document by the African continent that all of the people who are working on AGOA's reauthorization are at least aware of and are attempting to respond to. So with that in mind, I have Ambassador Sanders, Robin Sanders. I've got Mel Foote from Constituency for Africa, who's been an Africanist all of his adult professional life. And I got Ni Akwati, who's also been a journalist and also is very knowledgeable and a big player in U.S. African policy. So I'm not going to try to take the time to introduce them. You've got it in your programs, but I'll let them introduce themselves, talk, and focus on what they're doing and what might be of important to our topic, which is how do we follow up? How do we make sure that what we're talking about is not just good conversation, but it's going somewhere and we can then actually get something not accomplished, but sustainable and accomplished. And with that, Robin.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
I'm going to, first of all, talk a little bit about, very little about what I do. I am the CEO of the Feeds Advocacy Initiative that focuses on food security, education, energy, environment, development, and self-help. And we have strategic partners across the continent as well as here in the United States working on those issues. But today, since this is about next steps and future strategies connected to the summit, I'm going to limit my remarks to that area, and I'm actually going to focus on really giving you a little bit of a context that I want you to think about as you hear all of us talk about next steps and strategies for engaging the continent. I'm particularly going to focus on the diaspora element because that's an area that we work on very, very closely in terms of advocacy and really connecting African Americans and Africans to some key issues. But I wanted to give you a couple of stats. I'm at heart a researcher. I have my doctorate in information systems and technology, and so I think it's always important to have the context. But here's one. I assume that everyone remembers the overarching themes of the summit. They were investing in Africa's future, peace and regional stability, and governing for the next generation. My remarks are going to be in that context, but here are some illustrative figures that I want you to think about. Africa's population right now is reportedly 1.5 billion people and is on course to be 2.4 billion by 2040. That means the average growth rate is 2.45%. This will make Africa the largest continent in the world by 2040 in terms of population. So I'm arguing that demographics and population is something that we need to think about when we're talking about engaging going forward. So this is the context. Think about these things. There are 30 million people in sub-Saharan Africa aged between 10 years and 24 years. There are 561 million is the number of youth that are expected to enter the wage-earning years in the next decade. Addition to that, 10 million wage earners in that same demographic will enter the job market yearly. There are 75 million working age population right now that's looking for work. They have no work. They have no prospects for work. The good news, there are a lot of things that are good news as well. 31 of the top 1,000 banks that were highlighted in This is Africa recently are African banks. You have 1 billion Africans with bank accounts today when 10 years ago you didn't have a figure like that. And you have 736 million people on the continent with mobile phones. So these are the good news stories that I want you to think about as well. Some of the challenges still that remain, you have 547 million people living without electricity. And when we talk about SMEs and the future of how we engage the middle class, think about this. There are only 12,000 microfinance institutions on the continent. So when you look at those figures, it's very important to think about what we do, how we engage, what are the strategies, and what are the next steps. So from my perspective, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. There are a lot of issues that we can focus on in next steps, and given in the interest of time, I'm going to limit mine to sort of the entrepreneurial SME space for the moment. But this does not mean that human rights, conflict resolution, democracy, good governance, better health systems, are not important and not part of the work that we do. And just a little economic note on the impact of Ebola. I just came back from New York attending a number of sessions. But one of the figures that stood out to me, for the 3 primary affected countries, they to date have lost $870 million. So what does that mean going forward with what we all can do? But as I said, I was going to focus on the diaspora and SMEs and some sectors I think that the diaspora needs to be involved in more. You know, small and medium-sized enterprise is a term we use all the time, but I like to think of the role of SMEs as being strong and maverick enterprises, because you're going to be the key to the development space, I think, on the continent. Not only because you provide an opportunity to connect African Americans and Africans back to key development issues, but because you have a fundamental role to play. There are 331 million people with disposable income on the continent. But remember the population figures I gave you. That's not a lot. And there are only 30 million SMEs. So what does that mean for growing the middle class? What does that mean for the future, whether you're working on education, whether you're working on agriculture, whatever business sector you're thinking about, whatever trade you're talking about, we have got to grow the SME because that grows the middle class. So here are some of the strategies that I think that we need to focus on. We certainly need to think about the diaspora as a big D. And when I talk about the diaspora, I'm talking about African Americans and Africans, and finding ways to work together. There are a lot of wonderful programs that the U.S. government has. I won't repeat them. I'm sure you heard all of them this morning from Commerce and OPEC and EXIM and others, and USAID. But we need to find the ways for SMEs, diaspora SMEs, to get their foot in the door. We struggle to get our foot in the door on a number of these programs, and we need to speak up and find ways to address that. I think it's encouraging that we need to push for more procurement opportunities, more partnership, more subcontracting opportunities than we have, because that increases the trade element that was talked about a little earlier. In addition, I think that some key strategies for you to think about and where you need to enter, these are the areas where I do not see diasporans working or working enough. They are agriculture, aviation and ports, housing, information systems and communication, all range of service institutions, and manufacturing. On agriculture, I'm really talking about climate-smart agriculture. As I said, I was just in New York, and climate-smart agriculture is really, really important. And for instance, you know, there are only 12% of African countries are using renewables and looking at answering the energy issue. And it really needs to be about 40% over the next decade. 3/4 of the continent uses fossil fuels, so we need to really look at agriculture. The growth rate in agriculture right now is 3.6%. Remember the context of the population I gave you at the top of my remarks. It needs to be 6.6% or greater. In addition, how do you address the hunger issue? You've got 800 million hungry people in the world, of which 239 million of those live on the continent. So these are issues that we need to really focus on, find ways to engage as SME, find ways with vocational training, find ways with entrepreneurship. Quickly on information, communication, and technology, I don't see a lot of us in that space. There are a number of things we can do. There were 30 billion apps downloaded over the last couple of years. Most of those came from the continent of Africa, and most of the creation of those came from the continent of Africa. These are workaround technical solutions to issues from social to education to access to information. This is an incredible space for us to be in. Aviation and ports. I'm not talking about competing with Boeing or other big airlines or transportation facilities, but food service, catering, transport services from airports to airports. I don't see any of us in that space. Housing. Poverty figures affect affordable housing. The same figures that I applied for poverty apply for affordable housing. If you are poor, you either are unsheltered or you're not living in affordable housing, or you're not living particularly in housing at all. You have 647 million people in that space. So poverty is really key. As I wrap up here, service and manufacturing, I'm talking about the broad range of services. Keep in context the figures, the population, the mobile phone, what are the mobile platforms you can create, et cetera, et cetera. So on manufacturing and services, I don't see us in hotel services, food and cosmetic, household goods, and manufacturing. And my last point is really a recommendation. I know that you've heard a lot of discussion today, but my recommendation would be based on what we do in feeds, and certainly working with a number of the organizations that have spoken today, and a number of the government institutions that have spoken today. So I think we have to create a broader policy-focused diaspora network initiative where we are actually presenting policy papers to policy leaders about where our voice is, what are the issues that are important to, how do we see the issues differently, how do we want to engage differently, how do we want to talk about these issues differently, and how do we see what they're doing not really fitting with what we're hearing on the ground. There's a tremendous amount of networks across the board that I applaud, I think are fantastic, that have been working in this space for a long, long time. I know there's an effort for a unity caucus as well, but I would like to add to that the idea of really crafting policy papers on a regular basis, whether it's on AGOA, whether it's on access to for SMEs and diaspora SMEs to get into the space more. But certainly I think that we need to get into the policy recommendation role as the diaspora, and I will stop there.
Listen. Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Now we're going to hear from Mr. Foote, Mel Foote's constituency for Africa.
Great. Thank you very much. First, I want to congratulate our leader, Congresswoman Karen Bass. Really is one of my favorite people on Capitol Hill. She gets things done, and she's a pleasant person to work with, but you got to know that she's working all the time, and if you're going to be around her, you're going to be working all the time. So thank you very much, Congresswoman. I also want to say something about the last panel. A lot of people fight to get on the first panel because the room is full. I always fight to get on the last panel because by the time you get to the last panel, you're down to the hardcore. You're down to the ones who really, really, really want to be here. A lot of them want to come to take the picture and see Raj Shah and all this kind of thing. But when you get to this point of the program, you really do get to the point where people are really seriously want to know what the next steps are. I also want to say something about agonizing versus organizing. And, a lot of times we as a community spend a lot of our time agonizing. I paid attention to the Ferguson, Missouri situation this summer and all the crying and the whining. I might ask myself now, has anybody sat down with those people to get them straight on the voter registration process, now that the cameras are not on, And so we have to kind of take light of that. My organization, the Constituency for Africa, our mission is to educate the public about Africa, improve cooperation, coordination among those who are working on African issues, and we work to shape U.S. policy toward Africa, And I can say I've been involved in Africa. Now, I got started in 1973 as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia and Eritrea. This was during the war and during the revolution in Ethiopia. And we talk about the Young African Leaders Initiative. I remember back then when Mengistu Haile Mariam started a program called Zamecha. And it was to get the young people in Ethiopia and Addis Ababa to go out to the rural areas to help people with health care and education. And people almost went crazy. They went out there, all of a sudden saw how the people really live, and it was shocking for young people. So I don't know if President Obama knew it at the time, but that's a precursor to the Young African Leaders Initiative. I want to also say something about Ebola. I just got a message that the chief, special assistant to the chief medical officer in Liberia passed away today from Ebola, and so that the whole health system in Liberia right now is in absolute shock. All the staff have been quarantined for 21 days. Think about that, and pray for our sister Ellen Sirleaf Johnson and the people of Liberia and West Africa. But we work to educate Americans about Africa, to galvanize support. And I can say we've been highly successful in our years. We're 25 years into existence. I can say we had our fingerprints on every major piece of legislation concerning Africa, including the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, including PEPFAR, and including the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit that just took place, and the Young African Leaders Initiative, which were initiatives that we proposed to President when he first took power, when the country was in economic morass and first black president and the banks that collapsed, and what can I do about Africa with no money in the bank? So we talked about the need to bring together the African leadership, and called the White House Conference on Africa. So I personally am thrilled about the summit. A lot of criticism about what was going to happen. The president wasn't going to meet with the African leaders one-on-one. The president didn't want to directly engage diaspora in the process. All kinds of issues. I had mine also. But I can say that overwhelmingly the summit was a tremendous success, no matter how you look at it. It changed the paradigm. Africa and America will never be the same. We are connected at the hip. Karen Bass is absolutely critical to the process. And while I had criticisms, I think that a lot of these can be taken as we start moving forward. Again, don't spend your time agonizing and bemoaning the fact. What can we do going forward? Few ideals. One of the initiatives that President Obama has announced is he's forming a presidential commission on doing business in Africa. In other words, there's going to be a committee that's going to help recommend how we can strengthen the summit goals going forward, And I think that's a great ideal, but I think we have to look at the composition of that committee. I don't want to see 25 white guys on the committee, I want to see some people who look like diaspora, on that committee. And I want to see small and medium-sized businesses on that committee. I want to see women-owned entrepreneurs on that committee. And so I think the committee ideal is excellent. Now the game is who's going to be on the committee. And that's where I want to play. I want to play in the game of who's going to be on that committee, because we want to make sure that committee actually has teeth. One of the ideals that I proposed to the President and to the White House about the summit was that on August 7th, I wanted to have regional meetings outside of Washington. I wanted to have a meeting in Los Angeles led by Karen Bass. I wanted to have a meeting in Houston, one in Denver, one in Seattle, one in Chicago, all led by CBC members or good friends of Africa, where 4 or 5 presidents from, there were 50 of them here. 4 would go to LA, 4 would go to Chicago, 4 would go to Houston, And if you want to talk about energy, you go to Houston. If you want to talk about mining, you go to Denver. If you want to talk about Hollywood and Nollywood and Silicon Valley, you go to Los Angeles, You want to talk about lumber and timber, you go to Seattle, And I thought that, you get the presidents to go out and, based on their interests. And in the morning, there would be a business roundtable, and small and medium-sized businesses would have been there. They wasn't here in Washington. This wasn't about us, but they would have been in Los Angeles. They would have been in Chicago. They would have been in Houston. So in the morning, business roundtable, doing business in Africa. In the afternoon, town hall meeting on Africa, so that the average person out there would touch a president, hear what a real president is saying about their country, what the real president is saying. And then in the evening, all the big shots, the mayors and the state legislators and muckety-mucks would have had a chance to, really get a chance to interface with the African leadership. I think that would have transformed the summit, beyond Washington. Now, we were all transformed, no question about that. But I don't think they were transformed around the country, And so I was advocating for a regional approach on the last day that they go out. They didn't do it, I think, partly because it maybe came to them too late, partly because of the logistics of it. But I think this is something that can happen as part of the follow-up, And I think the African leadership are ready to come back and be part of this. I think we can still do these regional meetings outside of Washington, because it's very important that we engage the American people in the process. We in Washington, we get it. We understand the country, we understand the dynamics, we understand the politics. But if you go outside the hinterland, outside this beltway, and you talk about Africa, how many countries in Africa? Oh, 1,000. Oh, no, one country in Africa. Africa's a country. You get all kinds of things. And I think if America is truly to engage in Africa, we got to engage with them outside the Beltway. A lot of people think that since we had this big summit here in Washington, the first thing you do after having a big summit is plan another summit, We've all been there, Summit 2, Summit 3. And my recommendation to the president is the last thing you need to do is have another summit, If you're going to have a summit, have it right before you get ready to leave the White House, in 2016, to hand it over to your next successor. Some say Hillary Clinton, but I can't say that up in here. So I think that the next step will be the president to load up a plane in 2015, Air Force One, with entrepreneurs, big and small, and go and visit 4 or 5 countries in Africa, regional meetings, and Addis Ababa, and go down to South Africa, and maybe stop off in Kenya, and maybe go over to Ghana and Nigeria and so forth, and have regional meetings with all those entrepreneurs who came here. Keep in mind that the summit this year was not about these presidents. Everybody talked about the presidents. It wasn't about the presidents so much as it was these entrepreneurs who came. Dangote, the wealthiest man in Africa. Tony Alumino, man of big ego. But guys who have tremendous resources, who are looking to engage with Americans. And so I think we need to do a reciprocal process outside of go to Africa, but make 3 or 4 stops and meet with those entrepreneurs on the ground. Look at the projects that we're talking about. Let's make some of these things that we talked about in Washington. A lot of times, things we talk about in Washington at these conferences, that's as far as they go. And what I would be interested in, all these billions of dollars that have been put on the table here, I want to make sure they hit the ground in Africa. And I think that one way would be, to do that. I also think that the White House should have a fund to educate Americans about Africa. We need a CFA and organizations like mine need resources to educate Americans about Africa, and we need grants. We need grants. These corporations are stingy. They don't want to give up their money for the kinds of things we need. But the everyday American need to be educated about this stuff, and we need the support of Congresswoman Bass and the White House to get the resources that Bernadette needs, that I need, to educate Americans about Africa. And I want to say, finally, that's really the biggest problem facing us in this country, the diaspora, the biggest problem we have is the issue of unity, And some of this go back to Marcus Garvey and Kwame Nkrumah and C.L.R. James and Padmore and Patrice Lumumba and Dudley Thompson and, the list goes on, We have got to educate ourselves and build the unity among us. Everybody here, whether you were born in Nigeria, or you're born in Ghana, or you're born in Chicago, you are an American of African descent. We all have different things that we bring to the table. I'm not an ambassador like Ambassador Sanders, but she can't do what I do either, But we think that working together, we can get much further in the process. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Next is Ni Akwanti, and Ni's going to talk the same as Mel, the same as Ambassador Sanders, what he does and what he thinks the next steps might be in a generic kind of opening comments. Ni?
Thank you very much, Walker. And I also want to thank the audience members, who have stayed. Yes, the people who are the most committed stay through it. So it's wonderful to have you, and this can be an intimate conversation. Of course, I also want to thank the CBC and Representative Bass's staff. Now, last year, Ms. Bass had me on the panel, and this is sort of an apology because something I should have said that I didn't say, and I've been thinking about it for a year, and so I was stunned and glad that she put me back on the panel to correct my mistake. Last year, I should have told her this. I just wanted to say that I know for a fact that Africa loves you back because they feel your love. So, thank you very much. Now, I was sitting there with Franklin Moore, who has nothing to do with this, but the issue of YALI came up so much that I made him a promise that I will talk about it, because here's the thing. When I was listening, many people said it would have been good if YALI, the YALI fellows, the Mandela Washington fellows, had discussions with their heads of state. Now, but here is what came back from the inside, and I've heard it from several people. The African presidents actually were mad at President Obama for bringing YALI here and saying, you don't choose our leaders for us. Now, I was stunned by that. I was absolutely stunned. I've had some friends also who've raised questions about YALI. I actually think YALI is a great idea. Some people have said, well, if they are bringing them here, what's the CIA doing? And my view is, if young Africans who are so bright are not ready to go out into the world and experience America and see what is being done, then we are in big trouble. In fact, I think President Obama has done Africa a huge favor, one of many, by doing YALI. Let the young, bright Africans get out there and mix with everybody and hold their own. So I am still stunned, but you ought to know that if they didn't meet with the heads of state, it wasn't because Washington didn't facilitate it. In fact, I even heard it before YALI happened, because I was a reviewer for selecting YALI people, and then afterwards, when the summit was put together and I was approached about how you organize it, and I had discussions, and I did hear from the State Department, people were saying, well, you know, we think the African leaders are worried that we are bringing young Africans here, and what are we doing to them and with them? And as an African, I'm still stunned that our leadership will think that if somebody is helping our young people go out, that's a bad thing. And I would like to remind them, some of our best leaders, not all of them, but some of our best leaders were fired up by being educated outside. I am from Ghana. Ghana wouldn't be from where it is if Nkrumah hadn't come to school here. And who says it? Julius Nyerere said it. He said Ghana was such a leader because Nkrumah came to school in the United States and learned from African Americans. So I just thought, I can't believe that African leaders would take issue with YALI. So we need to go and talk to our leaders and say, if you are a head of state and you are worried about a 25-year-old spending 6 weeks in Washington, you've got bigger problems. Now, I am listed, and I asked to be listed as belonging to a group called the African Immigrants Caucus. But I've also been in Washington. Actually, this is my 39th year. Washington has been my home that long. So my joke is I know where all the bodies are buried. And I've worked a number of jobs. Walker introduced me as a journalist. I was editor at Trans-Africa for like 11 years, so I guess technically he's right. I taught at Georgetown. I headed Africa Action. And so this is a new engagement for me, and I'm very excited about it. It is connected to Ebola, but I want to do justice to the panel title that we were given, Next Steps for Engaging the Continent. And I have actually linked it to the summit. And so I think there are 4 next steps. Now, there will be a lot of steps, because I know for a fact, as the Congresswoman's staff mentioned, you know, we will soon have a breakfast, one of the regular breakfasts, so we'll have occasion to discuss a lot of issues. But for now, some of the steps that I think we need to look at, a couple of things that jump up at me. I want to emphasize again that if you look at the history of African Americans, this country, and their engagement with Africa, it is an amazing story. I've always said that the black world's biggest deficiency is getting great writers, because we have great stories that are not being told. And one of them is the African American engagement and help to Africa. It is huge, it continues, and it is wonderful. But the one thing I want to say about it is that everybody must remember that Africa and Africans have agency. They do things on their own. And one of the best ways to help Africa is to say to the Africans, well, we think we see a problem. How do you see it, and how can we help? It's not a matter of saying, I know what your problems are, I'm here to help you, sit back and listen to me. That doesn't work. And so I just want to highlight that. That's one of the first steps. And then, of course, the second step of what should be done next. My second step, and again, it's not for all time, but just in the aftermath of the summit, is let's properly evaluate the summit, and then implement and carry forward what was promised. Because if the promises are forgotten, we are in a bad place, and if we don't properly evaluate it to see what went right and what went wrong, that will be a problem. From my own point of view, I think that there were two things that I would have liked to see more of. And the first panel, which are the human rights people and all, I mean, I agree with them. I wish that the democracy angle, and by the way, I dislike the term good governance, because if you are a dictator and your city is clean, like certain countries, or you make the trains move on time, they will tell you that it's good governance. No, I think the only thing we should talk about is democracy. Leaders who listen to their people, who are chosen by their people, and do what the people want. We don't need authoritarian development where one leader stays in place and says, well, I am making things hum on time, so that is good governance. We should stick with democracy. And I would have liked the summit to talk, to spend more time on democracy. Now, I do understand why they didn't spend the time, because as many people have said, it was in reaction to China. China is not a democracy, and when it's in Africa, it's just economics. Get the resources as fast as possible. So that skews, if the U.S. is trying to match them, you can understand why. But I actually think that the U.S. pushing democracy in Africa, now, I'm very biased on this, but I think it's a good thing. I think it's an American advantage. And Walker, forgive me, I have one quick story. Chinese TV called me and put me in a debate, and basically their argument was, you see, the Americans realize that their policy towards Africa is terrible, so now they are doing a summit like we have been doing, you know, and they are copying us. And I said, hold on a second. With all due respect, I think that's crazy. I don't think Americans are apologizing for their Africa policy. And as for the democracy that they insist on, I actually think they don't insist enough. And I am an African, and I live in Washington, and I think when they push democracy, that is good for Africa because it's good for the African people. Now, we taped that show on the 7th of this month, and they told me it will be aired on the 11th. They have canceled the show. Anyway, I think we should have done more democracy with the summit, and I hope that it will be done. And then finally, the next thing that the final step in this time period, and again, I'm not looking too far ahead, maybe just over the next year. What do we do in the 1 year after the summit? The final step I'm saying is this, and actually is the most important. We have to stop Ebola. It is true, Ebola is devastating West Africa. I mean, I've had people say taxis can't get business because they don't know who they're going to carry. Hotels that have capacity for 300 people are getting no one. So Ebola is not just killing ordinary people, it's not just killing the health professionals, it is also devastating business. And so the earlier we bring it to heal, the better. And I hope that in the next round of questions I can go in, because the new group that I'm part of, which is so exciting, I mentioned how long I've been here because I've seen a lot of groups and a lot of NGIs, non-governmental individuals. This one is very exciting, and the number one issue now is Ebola. And they are planning a number of things. So thank you very much, Walker.
Nee, thank you. Let's give them. Before we start the second round, I just want to thank the Congresswoman Bass myself for this opportunity and for your steadfastness in making sure that Africa stays important and stays in the forefront of the U.S. agenda. So I want to thank you. Leadership Africa, and to try to drill down a little bit, is an organization that facilitates. So when we go into a program, we try to facilitate and we see where the end game is going. So what I'm going to ask the panelists in a few seconds is to focus on one or two things that their organizations are doing and that they are doing that they see as connected to or can be considered following up to the Leaders Summit or the U.S. African Energy Ministerial or the trade initiative that's going forward, or Feed the Future, but something so that we can frame and comprehends so we can get a little more specific and drill down a little bit. Now, for ourselves, we are drilling down on AGOA's reauthorization. So we are already in conversations with the diplomatic community on that initiative, because that, as you heard in the earlier panels, has to be a priority. If the U.S. government and the Congress does not pass AGOA, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot, because the African leaders came here and said it's the most important legislation affecting Africa in a positive fashion that the U.S. has ever put forward. So it's that. Another thing, someone talked about SMEs. Well, one of the things I did with the U.S. African Energy Ministerial was to ensure that I had SMEs from the United States attend. I can report to you today that one of those who attended is partnering with a very large Fortune 500 company, and they're working in one of the African countries on energy and power. So you put people and ideas together and you see it too until they get something accomplished. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask first Ambassador Saunders to talk about and drill down a little bit on some of the things very specifically that have her priorities, that are her top priorities on follow-up.
Thank you, Walker. I also want to add my voice to thanking Congresswoman Bass, her leadership on the continent, her leadership here with the diaspora, her staff, who is just dynamic and always engaged, and certainly all of you for staying and being here. In terms of where I'm putting my energy and effort, I talked about SMEs, and that's where I'm spending my time, and that's why I don't see, as I said, enough diasporans working in the space that I've talked about. Most notably, working on agriculture. We have a climate-smart agricultural project, not only in Nigeria, but in 3 other African countries, that pulls together all the elements of development. Food security, we're training young farmers to be entrepreneurial farmers. We're even working in northern Nigeria. I was just there in June. We're making sure that we also work to train young women to be farmer entrepreneurs, not only because they can feed themselves and feed their families, but they also then have income and work with other farmers so they can produce enough to actually be able to sell and make a living for themselves and for others. So think of farming, or think of agriculture, or think of the development space of agriculture being entrepreneurial farmers. When you look at the fact that most of the African population works in the agricultural sector. The other strategic partnership that we work on is in the ICT space. I talked about these workaround solutions, and maybe I need to explain that a little bit more. But you know, there are a lot of challenges in the social and education sector, and even in the power sector on the continent. Bandwidth is an issue. There are a lot of examples like that. One of the strategic partners that we have has developed a workaround on bandwidth issues for education. And so we've created a tablet. The entire semester of a university gets downloaded onto the tablet at the center, and once it's on your tablet, you never need to have to go back to worrying about a bandwidth issue to be able to do your coursework. You're able to register for classes online without worrying about the bandwidth issue. So there are a lot of interesting workaround solutions that I think we need to look at. And the last is the power sector. We have 2 power-focused projects. One is Power Tech that looks at providing more transparency in revenue sharing that comes from the power sector, so that it actually gets used in the social sector more. And the other one is an actual power project that focuses on part of the privatization that's going on in Nigeria, so that you're actually producing more megawattage for rural areas in the southern part of Nigeria. And I'll stop there.
Well, let me say that you know, the Walker's challenge is a big question. And what are you working on? We're working on all kinds of things, and we got a little small organization that's doing it. But I want to say that specifically, we're working to shape how the United States will respond to the summit. You know, we've already written our ideals in writing, sent them to President Obama, Vice President Biden, to the senior White House staff. We send it to the national security staff. We send it to key members of Congress already, with specific ideas about what we want to see in terms of follow-up. Now, we actually going to push the lever. One thing that I found out in Washington, if you're not here to lobby, you really ought to be in Cleveland or some other place. But Washington is about access to power and pushing the buttons. So this is a week of our annual conference, the Ronald H. Brown African Affairs Series. We do it every year. We tie it into the Congressional Black Caucus. We promote the Foreign Affairs Braintrust. But our theme this year is promoting the STEM revolution in Africa, a diaspora priority. When I look at a lot of the challenges in Africa, including Ebola, including HIV/AIDS, a big part of the problem is we have a lack of human capital in Africa that's trained and ready to address these problems. A lack of engineers, a lack of math, a lack of science. Dr. Janetta Cole would add arts to that. So we're going to launch it. We have a town hall meeting on next Tuesday at the World Bank on this very theme. You all are invited to come into the World Bank. Bring your wheelbarrow. You haul out all the money if you like. But this whole week, this week and next week, we're promoting this STEM revolution in Africa. Now, one of the big activities of the Ron Brown series, on October the 3rd, we're having a conference called Diaspora Leaders. These are diaspora leaders all over the world. We have a delegation. The most organized diaspora right now is in Australia, believe it or not. So they're going to be on the call. We got Trinidad, we got Jamaica, we got Europe, we got Canada, all a part of this conference call talking about how we actually work together. To me, it's a huge step. We met each other at conferences and that kind of thing, and then you see each other 2 years later. But for the first time, we're trying to establish on a quarterly basis a conference call of diaspora leaders to talk about collaboration and working together. So I think in terms of what needs to get done, we need to educate, we need to advocate, and we need to shift U.S. policy toward Africa. We need to renew AGOA right away. It's the low-hanging fruit. Trying to get this Congress to get something big and dynamic, it ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. But I think we can actually get AGOA renewed. I spent a lot of time talking to Congresswoman Bass about this. She's passionate about it. She educated me about a lot of aspects of it. And so we're gung-ho in support of it. And we need to make this happen in the coming weeks. We want, when Congress come back, to hear nothing but AGOA. Whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, they need to hear it. And they need to hear it in their districts. Not just here in Washington. Sometimes when you take them up in Washington, they just say, make sure you spell my name right, But if you take them up in Louisville, Kentucky, and you take them up in Cleveland and Chicago and places like that, you'll find that you get their attention because they're out trying to get votes. The last thing they want to hear is that I'm not being responsive to my constituents. So we learned that lesson a while back when we passed AGOA. We need to take that message outside the Beltway, take it to the districts of these key members of Congress, make sure that AGOA gets renewed in the coming weeks and months.
Good. Listen, I want to thank Mel, but I want to remind him of something he didn't say. We had a meeting at Africa earlier in the week, and one of the things that came up was a response to Ebola that CFA and Africa are putting together, and I'm pretty sure he would like to invite those who really want to get their hands dirty and really help out to come to this meeting, if he will remind us when and where it's going to take place.
It's going to be on Friday, October the 3rd, part of the Ron Brown series. It's going to be at the Africa Union Mission. We now have official home for the Africa Union here in Washington. It's at 1640 Wisconsin Avenue Northwest. It's in the Georgetown, and it's from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock p.m. I just talked to Nee about it. I want to get Nee involved, and now he has his new capacity. But it's a briefing. We have we're going to have the ambassadors from Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. We're going to have a missionary who just came back from Liberia. She was evacuated out of there, going to talk. And we're going to try to get somebody from the CDC or the State Department official to share some information. But we want to help mobilize diaspora engagement to address, like Nee was right. I mean, the elephant in the room is Ebola. We say we want to say about trade, we want to say about democracy, but if we don't get Ebola under wraps, soon, we're not talking about 5 years from now, we're talking about right now, and don't think you're going to limit it to Africa some kind of way, there's talk about mutation, there's talk about all kinds of things if you allow the thing to fester.
Okay.
Walker?
Right, thanks. Nee?
Yes, thank you. What are the priorities now, me and the African Immigrant Caucus? Number one, first and foremost, of course, I'm sure that it's no news to people that, you know, last year when I was here, one of the panelists is Professor Zeleza from Connecticut. And he has written a book actually called Africa's Diasporas. He's a professor. He gets mad if you say diaspora, because he says there are so many diasporas. Africa has a lot of diasporas. And so we need to keep that in mind. We are a network of family. And so the African Immigrant Caucus actually is starting more or less locally. One of the diasporas, I mean, I used to call it the new diaspora, but even that is not accurate. The census has a term that may be more accurate, which is the African-born. People like me, people like Fred down here, people who were born on the continent and now live here. According to the census, there are about 2 million. And I say, well, you've got to multiply us by 3, because I have 2 kids. You know, so there are a lot of such African sort of community people. And frankly, I've been an activist since I came to this country, and I don't think enough are. There's a huge group of them in the World Bank. They are absolutely brilliant. If you do your statistics, the census will actually tell you the most highly educated group in the United States are the African-borns. Now, it is only because we could get visas to come here to come to graduate school, just like me. So I don't think it's something that we should be screaming about too much, but it's a fact. So a group of highly educated people, and I think that they are not engaged in policy enough. And I have always screamed about it, and now we have an initiative to gather them, so I'm really excited about it. The other thing is that they are 90% of them are responsible for the 61 billion a year of remittances to the continent. This is more than aid and investment. So if you can get this community fired up and say, we want to speak up, it will be wonderful. So I'm really excited about it. So bringing the African-born and the community together to sit down and talk with the rest of the diaspora, I think is great, is the priority now. But in terms of programs, since I joined the Immigrant Caucus, we decided Ebola is so important. So number one, we started talking to the White House. Number two, in fact, Newsweek did a horrible story about the African community here. He said, we, the African-borns, we like to eat uncooked bushmeat, and we sneak it into the country, and we are bringing Ebola to the United States, and therefore the government should watch us. We have been trying to push back on it, and so we have that program of trying to correct how the media writes about Africa. Now, of course, these days, any group I'm in, I'm one of the few people with gray hair. Most people are younger than me, so I have to tell them, listen, here is what went on before. And I'm telling them the way the media writes about black people, not just Africa, but the African-American community is terrible. We have to fight it hard, and I think we should make an example of Newsweek. I'm saying let's put Newsweek out of business, because there are so many other sources of news, nobody will miss them, and we want to talk to the HBCUs to stop subscribing to Newsweek, to teach them a lesson. Also, the next thing AIC is trying to do on Ebola, actually, you know, we were thrilled by what the president did. Now, I've had some friends who said, well, you know, we are worried that it is the military. And they said, no, these are 3,000 soldiers who are going to build hospitals and equip them very fast. In the first phase, 17 hospitals, each with 100 capacity beds. So that is needed. But even the White House and everybody will tell you, we'll give you the hospitals and the equipment and everything, but we need doctors. Now, there are a lot of African doctors in the United States. One of the biggest is ANPA, the Association of Nigerian Physicians in America. So actually, AIC is canvassing, looking for African doctors to work with them, to persuade them to take training at CDC. We are already talking to CDC, so they can go into Ebola the Ebola countries for a month or so and come back. And I was very thrilled that Dr. Shah said that they will do something about it in helping and even maybe salary and others. So let me just be quiet here. As you can see, I'm excited and I'm going around. But the number one issue for AIC is getting Ebola stopped. Not by AIC, but mobilizing people, including the African community, to step up. Thank you.
Good. Hey, listen, thank me. Now, this is where it's your chance to provide input. There are 3 mics. There are one in the center and on either side.
Oh, Lord.
I'm going to ask that you make your question short, that you limit it to 1 question, or if you want to make a comment, that you make your comment inside of 1 minute. 1 minute. So it doesn't have to be a question. But I do want to hear from you, and I'm going to ask the panelists when they respond to respond and weave in what they did not get a chance maybe to say up until now. So with that in mind, I guess, and we'll go here and just keep going back across.
Okay, my name is Enoch Entry. I own an energy company, and I also started an organization trying to recruit young African entrepreneurs that are serious about change on the continent. And I would like to make this address to the whole panel, especially to Mr. Mr. Melvin Foote. I started an energy company in Ghana, and you are correct as far as the engineering expertise and the need for STEM, but the urge for STEM and the human capital is there. It's just that the hands-on experience, the expertise as far as having accurate, manufacturing and stuff of that nature, and recruiting, like manufacturing of electronics, cell phones, all business opportunities, and it's not there. That's what is urgently needed in order to fuel that change of manufacturing in the continent, and I would like to also, well, I just lost train of thought, but it would help if you guys can also provide a route for linking, okay, now I just remembered, linking students in Africa that are specifically eager to go to school in the United States, especially with the HBCUs that need to get in, but they get denied because, I can't find somebody that has $30,000 in their bank account that will be able to sponsor me so I could be able to go to university. And it will really help if you guys could do that to enhance the hands-on and open the minds of the African youth that is in the African diaspora, that is eager to learn outside of Africa and create change, because it is there.
Thank you. Let's take the next one. We'll take 3 and then we'll respond.
My name is Bridgette Harrington. I'm Managing Director of Gulf World Limited. I live in Ghana every day for the last 8.5 years. And right now, I probably would have commented on something else, but I want to talk about Ebola. I landed here on Sunday, and one of the things that I said to Congressman Bass was the fact that when we're talking about Ebola, we're talking about what's happening across the borders, but no one's talking about the porous borders. And so what do I mean by that? I mean along the coast, from Ghana into Liberia and on into Sierra Leone and all the way up where the fishing villages are, all of those people are going back and forth and back and forth. And although officially there's no Ebola in Ghana, unofficially there is Ebola in Ghana, because these people are coming back into their villages with Ebola. Their family members are contracting it. They're dying, but no one's talking about that. And the reason that no one's talking about it is because when they're going back and forth across the border, since it's on the ocean, they're fishermen, they're not really going through immigration or anything else. So that's something that I seriously think that we need to take a look at and start to have a discussion about, because until that happens, then nothing else is going to change. And then obviously there is a snowball effect, because then when we have big, huge holidays, all of the folks from the city go where? To the villages. So now you've gone into the village where you've met your uncle or your aunt, and somebody has died and nobody really knows what they've died from, and now you yourself have become a carrier of that disease and you're bringing it back into the city. That's number one. Number two, quickly here, all of the flights had shut down coming out of Liberia and going into Liberia except for Delta Airlines. And it's very interesting because Delta Airlines decided that, and let me just give you that route for folks that don't know. Delta flies from Monrovia into Accra, and from Accra straight into JFK. Now, Delta Airlines still flies in. The price of the ticket before Ebola was $350 to get from Monrovia into Accra. It's now $1,400. But again, you still have a way out. If you get on one of those airplanes, and although we say that it's not an airborne disease, but imagine if it's a disease that manifests itself within 21 days, and then all of a sudden the symptoms start to arise. I go to the restroom, you're coming out of the restroom, you've been in there doing God knows what, your hands are sweating or there's blood coming out, and I now touch that handle or flush that toilet, and now I touch myself and I have an open wound somewhere, I now have possibly contracted Ebola. So it's a little bit, in my opinion, it's something that we need to look at a little bit closer than, oh, okay, well, we can't spread it because the only family members are going to come into contact with it. And I'm going to be quiet now.
All right, thank you. One over here. And please,
Hello.
you know, keep it focused if you can.
Listen, I usually dislike when somebody mentions that to me. I understand protocol. It's rude when people spend too much time talking. So don't mention that to me. My name is Yaya Fanuse. I'm with United States of Africa 2017 project. Google us. This is an announcement. We are working on the setting up. It's going to be incorporated in America and also in Africa, the $54 trillion investment consortiums for the private sector of the Federation. We name it 54 because there are 54 countries in Africa, and we hope by the time we have the referendum in 2017, we will have at least $7 trillion. If you're interested in finding out more, I'll be at the back. Come talk to me.
Right, thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn to the panel. Do you have any comments or responses to some of the questions that we've had and some of the comments? Yeah, I'll start with you, Robin. Yeah.
On energy, the young man that talked about energy right here. The one thing that I mentioned earlier is the need for a bigger. Is the night on?
Yes.
Is it on now?
No. Talk for a minute.
Okay, how about now? Okay. On energy, one of the things I mentioned in my initial remarks was the need for manufacturing presence by diasporans on the ground, that FDI, that manufacturing presence, and you don't see that. And I think that that's a key to what you're talking about, because if you're a young energy company, you want to make sure you keep your costs down, and the only way to do that is you have manufacturing components that you need that are manufactured right there in the country that you're focused on. And so I see that beginning to take place, but I think that you're absolutely right. Those connections need to be greater and stronger. And I want to add to that whole commission on doing business in Africa that the president announced, the applications on that are due September 30th. You can find it at the Federal Registry, but it's really key that we do have that kind of voice that you're talking about, the diaspora SME voice in that group. And so please, I encourage you to take a look at that application. I think it's really important. I sit on the U.S. Africa Committee, and I sit on USTR's Africa Committee. And it's very, very important for us to have presence on all of those committees, because you hear what the policymakers are thinking. Hopefully you can provide influence and comments to what they're doing, and you can also then turn around and share that information out. Quickly on Ebola, I may be the only one in this room, I'm not sure, but when I was U.S. Ambassador to Congo, before Nigeria, I served in Congo during the 3 Ebola outbreaks there. And the lessons learned there, I don't necessarily see being applied here. The biggest one is how you engage culturally with the communities that are affected. And I worry about that with AFRICOM going in. You know, are they getting any kind of cultural training? Our soldiers before they go in? Are the health workers that we're trying to recruit, are they getting, because the issue that you talked about, if you're not dealing within the cultural context and explaining it through traditional leaders, whether they be religious or otherwise, then that the messages and the precautions and all the things you're talking about are going to be harder to move forward. So I'm sure that what Mel and Nii are doing are going to address that, but I just want to tell you from firsthand experience, that is to me the most fundamental thing that I don't see being done enough, and that needs to be done in a completely different manner so that you are really getting to communicating to people through their cultural framework. Thank you.
On the question of STEM, during the U.S. Africa Summit, we actually wrote an article that was published in the New York Times entitled "Africa Needs Science, Not Aid." And we had about 500,000 hits on the article. It got tremendous read on it. We sat down with Dr. Zuma, the head of the Africa Union Commission, about it, and we sat down with a number of the African leaders on it. So I was really amazed at this hunger for the science agenda. Now, the reality is that rubber got to meet the road. You know, 2 weeks ago on the 16th of September, we had a meeting with the USAID, the top level of USAID, to talk about an agenda. Immediately following our article that came out in the New York Times, USAID did a blog on STEM in Africa and all the things that they're doing on it. I love USAID, but I'll tell you what, you got to push them. You know, if you just leave it up to the rhetoric, you're not going to get very far. We're asking the administration to support the training of 100,000 engineers in Africa, you know, a part of the YALI initiative, you know. And I think it's specific kinds of things that one has to do. We're asking the U.S. government, the money is there. We're talking about shifting maybe 2%, 3% of what you're out there with toward a science and technology-led agenda, set up some sort of foundation to implement it. But there's a lot of work. You got to actually build up the support for it. You got to get congressional support for it. I want to say something about the vaccines also. The thing about Ebola that frightens me, I recall the battle to try to find a solution to malaria in Africa. Malaria is devastating, debilitating in Africa, but you know what? We haven't figured out a solution to it because it involves Africans. You know, people are not dying in Philadelphia from malaria, and so the researchers are not putting their money into it. You know, the reason HIV/AIDS got so much success is because once the money came out there, $15 billion from Bush, all of a sudden, GlaxoSmithKline's interested, you know. And so with Ebola, I don't think that right now the U.S. private sector and the U.S. The people out there who got the pharmaceutical community are going to put enough energy on Ebola, because yet the money is not there for them to do the research and to do their investment. They're not making the profit to do it. So I think, again, as a community here, it's incumbent upon us to lobby, to press, to make sure that our government, our private sector, the American people respond to it. And the urgency of this cannot be overstated. And I think everything I heard here, we try to be frank and honest about this, but I think that we're even underestimating the potential devastation that Ebola is going to have, not only to Africa, but globally, if we don't get it under control.
Me?
Thank you. I just say that on Ebola and Ms. Barrington, you are right about porous borders. I am the son of a fisherman from Accra. And so I know how, I have cousins and relatives who go down there. So I know what you are talking about. Secondly, I think the Ebola issue, it is a fast-moving fire that has to be brought under control. And so this is why I think surging people, the military, to go and build hospitals, and they are not going to treat anybody, they are just going to build hospitals and equip them, which is why I said AIC is focused on trying to find doctors who can go for a week. And by the way, CDC is going to train them. Now, you got me though, and Ambassador Sanders, I don't know if they are including cultural training. So that may be something to add. On the other hand, as I said about Newsweek, I think it's very important not to scare people too much about Ebola. It is a disease, and it is a dangerous disease, but it is controllable. I mean, the president sent a video to West Africa to say, people think you can get it through the air. You can't get it through the air. And the more people are scared, the more they panic and don't want to do things about it. Even the shutdown of airlines. I mean, all the African presidents are complaining. Africans in Europe are getting stigmatized. Somebody flew in from Nairobi into Frankfurt, and they shut down the whole building because they said, oh my God, an African just flew in. So we just have to keep to the facts. And it is a dangerous disease. We need to do a lot. Also, on the vaccines, I actually think I have a slightly different view. I think the people doing the vaccines are in a bind. I was asked, remember that Dr. Brantley, who testified 2 weeks ago, he's the American doctor who survived. And he's been in Washington, he's a celebrity, met with everybody. He was treated and he recovered. The best doctor in Sierra Leone, Dr. Khan, they didn't treat him and he died. And the question was why? And my take was, some people say, well, the vaccine is not ready. And there are authorities in the U.S. who have a record of experimenting when they are doing vaccines. So there is that worry that are you going to, because it's black people and Africans, you're going to inject them with vaccines that are not ready? On the other hand, if you don't treat them, they say, you didn't give them the medicine. So there is that difficulty. The only reason I fault for the dying of Dr. Khan is that they were in Sierra Leone, he was sick there, MSF did not talk to his family. They just decided, okay, we won't give him the medicine, ZMapp. And if it was in the US, if he can't decide for himself, they will ask his family. And to me, that was a sign of disrespect. They should have talked to his family.
Good, thank you. Listen, I'm going to change the format up just slightly so that we can get more questions in and we don't run over too long. So I'm going to ask that we maybe go to 5 questions, and I might direct it to one of the panelists to answer as opposed to all of them getting a chance to respond. But I do want to say one thing about the energy question and SMEs. There is a movement throughout Africa which they call localization. The governments are insisting that you come to their country as an investor, you must bring on a local partner and transfer your skills to that local partner. And it's a perfect opportunity for SMEs to get themselves connected around energy, which is a big, big plus in Africa, with their skill set. They just have to make sure that the people in the ministry are aware of them so that they can use the localization strategy that these governments have in place. And with that, question.
Thank you. My name is Arend Kowenaar. I'm an economist, consultant for the African Development Bank based in Nairobi and working on the macroeconomic capacity building in Eastern Africa. My question is about AGOA. We're talking about engaging, after the U.S. Summit, engaging Africa. The renewal of AGOA is up. My question to this panel is, what is your view on the use of AGOA as a political instrument? In other words, suspending it when things are perceived to go wrong on the political front, for example, unfair elections or a perceived coup d'etat. A case in point is 2009 Madagascar. There was Mali 2012. We stopped the trade preferences. Consequences are dramatic. Companies closed, took years to build them up. Unemployment increases. In the case of Madagascar, poverty rose by 30%, not all because of AGOA. Can we make AGOA less maybe apolitical or less political? The EU doesn't use trade sanctions when they don't see a political regime of their likeness. African countries don't punish each other when things are not going right on the political front. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Cleophas Katumba. I'm the leader of Congolese community in Western Australia. I came straight from Australia to ask you this question. My first question is in regard to the Ebola. When we are talking about Ebola here, we are just talking about the West Africa. I like the commitment of USA in West Africa in order to fight Ebola, but as Ambassador Sanders said, Congo experienced Ebola before that part of region. So right now in Congo, Ebola is there. So we are not talking about Ebola in Congo, and the military personnel sent by USA, they are not going to Congo.
Right.
So I want just to draw your attention about the Ebola in Congo. You know, Congo, I'm talking about the former Zaire, the Republic Democratic of Congo.
Big Congo.
So, you know, it's a failed state, so there is a fear that it might go to the Central Africa and a country like Sudan, because where the Ebola is happening in Congo, it's in the north, in Equateur province. The second question is about the criterium you used during, which was used during the last summit to invite the head of state from Africa. Mr. Mugabe, who is the president of Zimbabwe, I was also the leader of Congolese community in Zimbabwe, was not invited because of his track record on human rights. My question is this: if Mr. Mugabe was not invited, I'm not trying to be try to advocate for him. What about a president like the president of Gambia? His track record in human rights is very well known in the USA. What about President Paul Kagame and Kabila? Why that double standard when you are inviting the head of state from Africa? Thank you very much.
Equatorial Guinea.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jean-Paul, and I'm a flight instructor and pilot here in the U.S. I'm originally from the DR Congo, even though I'm French. I have two questions, and I'm very glad that Ms. Sanders here mentioned aviation earlier, but really briefly. Aviation is kind of the forgotten industry pretty much everywhere, even here in the United States. As just some few numbers, you are 10 times more likely to be killed flying over African airspace than here in the US. And that has to do because of the industry lack of equipment, lack of training. The plane that they fly usually flew under the Jimmy Carter government, which is really old. And just to see what will the US do at the World Bank and IMF to facilitate or make it easy for upstarting small company, aviation company, to flourish in Africa. Not just company, but flight schools, training education for pilots, and also equipment. Today, in the U.S., you have airports, small airports, county airports that are better equipped than some international airports in the U.S., in Africa, I mean. Thanks.
Thank you.
The second is about Ebola, since everybody's talking about it. In today's words, any virus outbreak is less than 24 hours from anywhere else in the world. There are some computer models that are actually forecasting Ebola to kill 2 million people by February. Will the U.S. wait in on the AGOA, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, to prepare the airlines that crisscross the world pretty much on a daily basis to prevent a pandemic? I disagree with one of the panel guys here saying we should not panic. I think we should really panic about Ebola. This is a serious business. It's a serious matter, and I think we should get all the stuff ready. And when we send the military to face Ebola, we're not really sending to fix it. Last time that it happened here in Virginia, they burned down the whole building because of Ebola. That's how they tackled it. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we go here?
Yeah, Dr. Falou again. Number one, about the unity of the diaspora. Somebody mentioned that was not aware that much in terms of what has been happening. First of all, 2 years ago, there were representatives from 4 groups that we identified. He mentioned 2 million from the Census Continental African, but there are, we estimated, about 4 million Afro-Latinos that are growing in identifying themselves as African descendants. Yeah. And that, of course, come from the revolutions that are happening throughout Latin America, where we have there 150 million blacks that more and more every day are increasing in identifying with Africa, including, of official ministries of the government in the South to South program with Africa. So that's a reality that is happening. And that unity resulted in writing the first report of the diaspora contributions and strategize together to some of the problems in Africa. For example, I conducted this mobilization with Congressman Menendez, who's president of the Foreign Committee, and for Power Africa, this mobilization resulted in tangible results in being approved. So for AGOA, definitely, and for some of the problems that was mentioned, we will do the same. Now, in terms of the SMAE, tomorrow I'll be speaking at 3 o'clock on the need to develop on-the-job manufacturing-based development of entrepreneurs in Africa. And we already have projected a project working first initially in Ghana, but the idea is that that pilot project will be used throughout different points in Africa for encouraging more SME development, especially manufacturing-based. We're going to need investment from agencies and from people. Anybody interested here in looking into this project, please see me or come tomorrow at 3 o'clock. We'll be making a more detailed presentation of the project. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon again, Brother Cliff from 6th Region Diaspora Caucus. My concern is primarily with making direct connections between the grassroots diasporas and each other, and between the grassroots diasporas and grassroots communities on the continent. For example, I know Cuba's a dirty word in the United States, but aren't they supposed to have some of the best doctors in the world? And are they being brought into this whole question of fighting Ebola? You've got issues of agriculture in Africa. Black farmers in Africa are having their land taken from them. Guess what? Black farmers in North Carolina are also having their land taken from them. Why is there no connection going on between those groups? And it would seem to me that it would be better to have a direct grassroots to grassroots connection, some way to do that other than going through a Fortune 500 company which uses money power, or a government which goes through state power. That way you don't have to worry about political considerations where people say Africa's resources are more important than its people. A European American gets treated for Ebola, but a Ghanaian doctor is allowed to die. Makes one wonder whether or not some treatment may be getting denied for some reason or another. And then there's also the question of going through Fortune 500 companies, drug companies, that sort of thing. Now there's a profit motive. So how can we better facilitate a grassroots diaspora to grassroots African connection?
Thank you. Listen, I'm going to ask that Ambassador Sanders take the question on transportation issue. I'm going to ask Mel to talk about unity and also give his thoughts on how people are chosen possibly to attend the Leaders Summit, or why certain countries might have not be able to continue in AGOA. That's a tough one, but I'm not saying he has the answer to it, but it's his opinion. Ambassador Sanders.
Yeah, the aviation, I'm going to stick and bowl on that answer too for a little bit. There are two areas that I think don't get discussed enough in the development. Housing, I already mentioned, and aviation is the other one. You're absolutely right. The aspects of aviation that you talked about, I worked on Category 1 and ICAO certification for Nigeria when I was there, and it is a big issue for Africa writ large in terms of getting that international recognition for your airport, your airline, so you have the trade routes that you're talking about for AGOA and for everything else. And without that, that's why you don't have a lot of African airlines flying directly to the United States, because they are missing that component. It takes a lot of work. It was a 3-year effort in Nigeria to get them Category 1, to get Delta to fly in, and for Eric Air to be able to fly into the United States. So it is no small feat, but it's one that we don't tend to focus on, but it is connected to everything else we're talking about. And that transitions me to my quick comment on Ebola in the interest of time. What I've been talking about on the news shows that I've been in vis-a-vis Ebola and aviation, connecting it with aviation, is that the aviation authorities of Africa are not communicating across purposes with each other. They have to be coordinated across purposes, have the same kind of stopgaps in place at their airports, whether it's testing and quarantine and dialogue and whatever, but you don't see that coordination across African airport authorities. And if we don't do that, that's just going to continue to exacerbate, including having that coordination with U.S. airports. We talked about Delta being able to fly in, but other airlines not being able to fly. You have to have that kind of coordination, and you have to have the same kind of standards of checks and balances across airport authorities, whether they're in the U.S. or whether they're in Africa. And the last piece on AGOA, on Ebola that I've been talking about, and that comes from my time in Congo. Ebola is generally connected to a food security issue. I will say that again, Ebola is generally connected to a food security issue. In this case, there's a double food security issue. One, point of origin, whether or not it was a bat that bit a rat that someone then ate as bushmeat, or whether or not, and that happens quite a bit. That's how it started in Congo. I mean, because the carriers are bats, bushmeat, and gorillas, generally. And so now the secondary food security issue that I don't know we're paying enough attention to is when you have markets shut down and you have people quarantined, like the entire country of Syria, then where are people going to get their daily food from? So the origin of issue is a food security question, alternative protein sources, and then of course the current situation where you have no commerce, no movement, people aren't able to go out and buy food for their families, feed their children, feed themselves, no movement. So there's a food security component to this that I want to highlight for everyone and also put on the table. That's something that we need to add more voices on.
Oh, thank you. Mel, I know you're a big component of unity, and the other one is kind of political, and I don't know if you have an answer for it, but if you do.
Yeah, I got an answer for that one.
And then, Nee, you might want to just make a comment on Ebola or whatever in terms of.
On the question of Zimbabwe and how people get picked and not get picked, I would say the speaker was absolutely correct. But I would say historically, sometimes when you're dealing with the National Security Council, when you're dealing with the State Department, you're dealing with members of Congress, we give them too much credit, about some of the decisions they make. I criticize not inviting Mugabe, when you invited Equatorial Guinea, you had Gambia up here. Somebody called this the monster's ball, because half the leaders are here, people who probably shouldn't have, we talk about democracy, come on. I went to one forum where Sassou Nguesso, president of DRC, was talking about the Constitution, and somebody raised the question, Mr. President, your term is coming up. Are you going to step down and pave the way for the next, election? And he said, the people got some problems, and let's see what the people say. Then they raised the question about the media and press freedom in the country. We have it in our Constitution. It's guaranteed in the Constitution. You know what I'm saying? You're speaking out of both sides of your mouth. And so democracy is a hard process. I think that the U.S. policy, by and large, lacks civil society participation. They're making decisions because Equatorial Guinea got oil. Point blank, This guy had been in power 42 years, I believe, in Cameroon. Come on, what is the issue here if we're talking about democracy? So I think it's incumbent upon us as civil society to put pressure on our government to do the right thing, Now, on the question of unity, I think Dr. Fallou is absolutely correct. I think we're learning. I was involved in the African Union's Diaspora Summit in South Africa 2 years ago. There are 64 countries there. Cuba was there, Venezuela there. And we got to talking to people for the first time, really, beyond politics of our government, And I think this whole thing about unity is powerful, because when you start thinking about the 800, 900 million people in Africa, the 500 million in Brazil, the 200 million over here in Central America and so forth, you talk about a market of maybe 2 billion black people. Then we could talk about competition with China. We could talk about competition with India. But until, where we keep seeing each other as different, and I got a problem with you because you're from there, and your nose is like this, we're all African. And we need to start thinking in that regard.
Mel, thank you. Nee, you want to make a comment on Ebola?
Yeah.
But we're going to keep it short, and we're going to take the last questions.
I'll keep it short. I think Ebola and how Ambassador Sanders tied it about earlier on airline travel. There's actually technology. You know, the airlines are afraid because they can't tell who has it or not. Even some African countries close their borders. But part of the engagement with the U.S. and the federal government is that there are technology that you could give to the Africans and the airlines so they can tell who has it and they don't have to say everybody, nobody gets on. And it helps solve the market issue. So I think that is a big part of it. Now, Walker, forgive me, but on the democracy issue, number one, many people think my middle name is democracy because I have argued for a long time the U.S. has a track record of supporting dictators from apartheid to today. And I think that is terrible and it should stop. So I confess to you, before the summit, I was one of several people who said, actually, it's not that you invite Mr. Mugabe, I'm making no statement on his situation, but that there are dictators who should not have come. Because there is this debate of authoritarian development versus democratic development. And we are a big family. It goes to the unity issue. I don't think the differences we have are because of how we look. Even if we look the same, we'll have different opinions. And my opinion is that, in fact, we have to make sure we develop democracy first. When we talk about economics and money, please forgive me, but I will remind you, even slavery was for making money. So we have to make sure we emphasize rule of law, human rights, the proper kind of trade, so we will have vigorous debate. And the debate may seem to divide us. So I was for not inviting African dictators to force them to democratize, to force them to be legitimate and talk to their own people. They should not be rewarded when they are abusing human rights and when they are staying in power for so long. And that even goes to the AGOA question of, should you stop AGOA if a government is violating rights? That's a difficult question, but I say yes. Dictators should not be rewarded. But we are a big family. Let's have a debate.
Right, thank you. Listen, and let's make your questions or comments very short so that we can try to finish up as close as possible to the end time. We'll start here and we'll take both. We'll finish here and we'll go here for the last.
Why you always start on the left? You should start on the right sometime.
Because I'm a leftist.
I'm going to pass on my statement because these two brothers spoke to some of my greatest concerns. But I just want to say that there are some folks on the ground, small and mid-sized companies that are doing all kinds of work. Brother I'm talking to wants to do refrigeration for meat that's mobile that can be taken to rural areas. So these kind of things, and Mel, maybe we'll talk to you about that. How do we start funding some of these kind of efforts to bring small and mid-sized operations, construction, et cetera, into the fold? Last one, our youth, born in the U.S., many generations. My son goes to Cal State Dominguez. He's a computer science major, math minor. He's the only at a school that's 40 or so % African descent. And he's the only one out of the 5 years he's been in that program that comes from African descent, that's dealing with math and dealing with computer science. We have to educate our young people in this country about the importance of taking science and technology when we go to college.
Thank you. I'm Amaka Wankwe Gomu by way of Baltimore. I just wanted to maybe piggyback on the gentleman's last response in terms of those of us that were born here and our parents immigrated here for reasons of education, professionalism, in hopes of taking it back home, which did or did not occur for various reasons. But in terms of the diaspora, there was a question asked in the second panel that was very foreign to me. Who is a diaspora? And I wake up every day and my whole family, my whole household is a diaspora. My husband is African born, as you mentioned earlier. I'm U.S. born. My children are second generation. There's just too many levels, so it doesn't matter. If you're in this room and outside this room, you're in the diaspora. And so I really wanted to behoove this group to really talk about what to do next. Because we talk about how. I think we have a lot of how responses. The how is how much bigger. So how much bigger? So how does Amaka not only have conversations within my household and my professional circles and my small Nigerian-based groups that are here now in the U.S. and having conferences and these larger conversations, how do we make it bigger? How do I take the strengths that I now possess because of the fortunes or experiences that I've had and take them larger, take them again outside of the walls or within? And then the sharing aspect, we've talked about, I think it started in the second panel with the sister from Kenya, but we talk about sharing SME to SME, but really what we're talking about is the twinning, the parallels between businesses, private, partner, public partnerships, as well as individuals. And so there were this call for cards in the second panel. Write down your name and sign up, and that's excellent, but what do we leave with? How do we now make connections in a way that's responsive and appropriate to the discussions that we've had in the room? Thank you.
I was actually going to talk about that a little bit. My name is Joanne Oport, and I am from Kenya. My concern is that there is great conversation on diaspora engagement, but I don't really see it. I've been in the United States, I think, about 15 years now, and I lived in Texas. And Kenyans are about 100,000 here in the United States, and there's almost a disregard to the level of professionalism and experience that is from the diaspora. And a lot of people are talking about, yes, we want to engage diaspora, we want to engage them, but there's almost like a creation of an elitist type of diaspora that you want to engage with, while you could very well like have your tentacles all over through the United States. Another concern that I have is the YALI was great. I love the YALI. I met a lot of the YALI young people who came in. What about the young African professionals who are down here? What are we doing to develop sustained mentorship for us? I have approached several of you and asked for mentorship, but we talk about going out and taking the Africans who are back at home, which is great, and I love it and I support. But what about us who are here, who do need that mentorship, and we don't have it? We need to create sustainable relationships in how we develop us. So if we're going to be able to train those who are there, we should also elevate us who are here. So that's maybe a question, concern, something you can talk about.
Hi, my name is Bishop. I just want to commend your effort in northern Nigeria, because I've been privileged to work for the University of Maryland, and I've traveled Nigeria as well. I have traveled to northern Nigeria to see women particularly working on these huge lands and just using a handheld tool. And my question is this: in terms of food security, I can't see how a nation like Nigeria and other African countries intend to have food security when you're still working with a handheld tool. So what is your organization doing to help encourage these farmers to go into mechanized farming? I mean, they might not have immigrant workers working on their fields, they might not have people coming in, but they need to be taught how to mechanize. I think that also will bring money to their pockets, because what I see them doing mostly is farming just enough to feed them through the year. In Africa, unlike here in the US, we have just two seasons, rainy and dry season. And the rain only comes in northern Nigeria for 4 months. The rest of the year, there's no rain. So you find out these farmers only farm their land when it rains. So what are we doing to teach them how to use the irrigation in these countries? Because the Department of Water Resources in Nigeria once announced that only 10% of the water resources in Nigeria is being put to use. So how are we going to teach them to farm the land round the clock, not just wait for the rain? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Simon Adeji. I'm originally from Nigeria. I have major concerns majorly on the SME project aspect as well as the Ebola. Growing up, my parents taught me to say when you point fingers at people, always remember the four others right back at you. So bringing you to what's your answer to responsibility. I am of a different generation where we believe we don't need to ask questions. We need to work. We need to put things in perspective. I started a media company back in Africa, and we established in 30 African countries. And when we decided to go digital, like building an app back in Africa, there was no investment put aside for that, because when you speak to the people in charge, they don't understand what you're talking about until you say you want to build a printing press, which is really getting outdated. And we decided to come into the United States, and right now as I speak, the Tarawa app is up. It came up 1st of September, and from the day it came up, we had a download of 1 million people. What I'm trying to say here is, when things are being called for, especially back home in Africa, they call the Dangote, they call the Tony Elumelu, but there are major young Africans doing things without government effort, without having to ask the United States to help. How did we get this fund? Nobody really cares. Right now, we are on, we're using the platform of GoDaddy as our server. And we did build a server to communicate back to Africa and Ghana. Where did this money come from? My point here is, we believe at the end of the day, you're dealing with a different generation. And I am getting really tired of the fact that there's so many questions about what is being done, rather than what are people doing? What are people really doing for themselves? So, my second concern is about the Ebola. And we were about to launch the Tarawa app in 8 weeks' time here in DC. And we moved the funds, and we said, you know what? We would do a fundraiser with our friends and our colleagues. And in 8 weeks' time, I want to see people buy the T-shirt. We want to do things. And I think it's enough of what is the US doing. This is an African situation, and Africans should also be a part of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Agoram DK from the African and Caribbean Faith-Based Leadership Council. I just want to raise an issue that we raised at the White House yesterday with the African American Faith-Based Leaders briefing. As it relates to the Obamacare, majority of our people who are on non-immigrant status, legal non-immigrant status, whether it be H-1B, R-1, whatever the visas are, as long as it's not a citizenship or a green card, they are not eligible for Obamacare. That's a huge proportion of our professional African population in this country that are not eligible for Obamacare. The sad thing about it is, the new African immigrants who become citizens of the United States, if they become citizens over a certain age, they are not eligible for Obamacare. And that is something I think we need to think about and we need to ask questions about. My last point on immigration is that the president has announced that it's likely to make an executive decision on immigration after the elections, which may be a month or a few weeks from now. And we are already being sidelined in the conversation. It's facing those who come through the borders. We have entered this country legally, most of us, and we are professionals in different fields. And there are a lot of our people that are hurting. They are professionals. They can't go back home. They are here, but they can't do anything. And I'm appealing to this audience, I'm appealing to us here, that we need to engage the White House to see that our concerns can be included in that executive order. Thank you.
Thank you. Les?
Michael Onyemelkwe, I'm with Morgan Stanley. And one of my questions, I guess the main point I have here is to the panel. And what are some means that we can use to fuse the development for developing nations? I mean, what are some things we can do to help bridge that standard of living? So we always make the point of how Africa is looked over because there are not enough investment opportunities in Africa. What are some ways we can fuse that gap in the standard of living in Africa? So how can we bridge that transition from here to folks in developing nations? And what are some things and what are some ways we can contribute to that? Both with the points a lot of people have raised here with young African professionals, a lot of the organizations and groups, and a lot of the political members and some of the investment banks. What are some things we can do to help fuse that gap? That's my main question here. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Why don't we let the panel respond, but let's respond briefly to and tie it to the questions that we just heard from, so it's focused on answering their questions to the extent that we can. Okay. Why don't you, Ambassador Sanders, and we'll go right down the end, and I'll close it out.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief in the interest of time, and I probably won't get to everything that was said. Agriculture, the gentleman that asked on agriculture, I'm not a proponent of mechanized farming at all for Africa. Given the number of small farm holders that you have, I also think that you have environmental issues that come with that. So what we're doing is focus on appropriate technology. We're using recyclable and renewable materials to build appropriate technology for tractors, things that don't require spare parts, that adds to the cost. Sometimes you can't get those. So you really need to look at the environment and use things that are in the environment. And that's what we do on pest control. That's what we do on irrigation, drip irrigation and RF-driven irrigation, so you don't have evaporation of your irrigation lines. So, think about things that are appropriate technology, and it doesn't have to be big mechanized things to have adequate and sufficient farming to be able not only to feed your family, but also to have enough to be able to provide income for your family. On aviation, I forgot one quick thing. A lot of African countries are beginning to look at developing African aviation schools. Nigeria has one in Kwara, and I think that needs to be replicated across the board so that you are training young Africans in the aviation field. And we don't have very many of those. On SME, mentoring, and opportunities, I think that what I haven't seen, what I'd like to see more of, hopefully, is networking between SMEs here and SMEs on the continent. And there are a couple of ways that I think you can think about doing that. I don't see, since I sit on XM and USTR, I don't see a lot of diasporans, and that's the big D, that's everybody under the big tent, using the tools that are out there that are free for you to use. You've got business centers with the Department of Commerce. You've got the small SBA, the Small Business Administration. They have an incredible wealth of free tools for you as an SME, incredible. You've got MBDA, same thing. I did with another partner, Africa Society, earlier in the year before the summit, a big program that focused on what SBA was doing to provide tools for you, networking and otherwise. We are not taking advantage of those tools. You're right on terms of opportunities for that are going on in the continent. I mentioned the 30 billion apps, and most of those being created by young African entrepreneurs to address workaround solutions. We need to really salute these guys. They're not getting enough attention. I was disappointed. I even said for the U.S. Africa Summit, why don't you showcase some of these talented African young entrepreneurs at the U.S. Business Forum instead of the traditional ones that we always hear from? And of course, that didn't happen. You got the Africa Diaspora Marketplace 3, which I think is starting October 1. Take advantage of that competition. There's a grant money that comes with that for your company. We're not taking advantage of all of those. Some of the founders and thought leaders behind the Africa Diaspora Marketplace, Stan Strata, Mel Foote, they have a third iteration of that. You're not taking advantage of that. And then for all of you who are not involved in STEM, I went back to get my doctorate in 2010. So no matter how old you're in a science field. So it's not just about making sure that you have that, for young people. We all need to get on the bandwagon so that we all are contributing in that area. And we're absolutely sharing that knowledge with the other STEM leaders coming up.
Good. Thank you, Ambassador Mel.
Yeah, in terms of what you can do in terms of your community and so forth. First of all, I'm not looking for more work to do, but my email address is mfote, M-F-O-O-T-E, 2420 at AOL.com. I do respond by email. And I would say that there's a lot of things that you can do. Some of the things that struck me immediately is, link with organizations like CFA. We have the conference, we have all kinds of tools. We found that in terms of building a constituency for Africa, engaging diaspora, there's a lot of training that's needed. We see a lot of really intelligent people out here trying to do something, but they do the stupidest stuff because they simply don't know. And so we ourselves have understood that we need to do some training to get people the basic ideas about how you go about doing this. How do you affect a member of Congress? How do you actually approach a member of Congress? And we need to do more of that. I think you can do a local town hall meeting on Africa in your community. If you're in Baltimore, why not have a town hall meeting on Africa? Ambassadors are available. A lot of the resources are free. They're just looking for the opportunity. I think you also need to have a letter writing campaign to your mayor, your city council people. You'll be surprised what you could do with a letter. So if you locally make your community Africanized, if you will. I think also there's commissions on African and Caribbean affairs. Stan has one in Philadelphia that's been a model, really, for bringing together the diaspora community locally and making them relevant to the local politics. You'd be surprised how Africa benefits a lot of these communities. They don't realize how much resources are there because of Africa. They'll be thinking Africa doesn't matter. Then if you look at the cocoa production coming through your port, you'd be surprised Africa does matter. I think an African essay contest for the high schoolers, maybe something for the younger ones to start to sensitize them about the countries of Africa, the peoples of Africa at an early stage. Part of the problem, a lot of us don't figure it out till we're 50 years old, and the reality is, we're late. And so there's another reason why we need to deal with the young African leaders. Second thing I want to say is October 2nd, we're having a forum at the State Department, open forum. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield is hosting it to talk about the summit, the follow-up, mainly aimed at diaspora engagement. Contact me for information. We want all of you to come up, show up. Thank you.
Thank you. Nee?
Thank you very much. A quick word on food security, which is very important. I just want to throw out one observation. It's been found that famine and starvation never occur in democracies. They've looked at India, they've looked at Ireland. So I guess I'm on my democracy kick. Now let's make sure we get good governments first who are governing democratically, because then the people elect you, they tell you what to do. If they need food, they will tell you. I think a huge mistake in Africa, and I've believed that for all my life, and I get stronger in the belief, when we think that one wise, strong man is going to solve the problems, and that people of the country, or because they are in rural areas, they don't have a lot of education, therefore they have to be told what to do. I think it's a huge mistake. It's also part of the reason I said at the beginning that even those of us here with a lot of experience and goodwill, we must always remember African agency. Just because people have a problem doesn't mean that they don't know what they are about. They probably understand their problems better than you do, and you can help them if you listen to them. So let's not impose solutions. Secondly, mentorship. I can tell you that I don't think there is anybody who believes in mentorship more than I do. I am looking for, basically I'm saying, listen, I want young people that I feel connected to know at 20 what it took me 60 years to learn. Moreover, I say I was supposed to be president, I'm not. So when the ancestors ask me, I'm going to say, don't worry, I have prepared 10 coming after me. So I am dying to mentor people, but it's a two-way street, and it takes institutions. And finally, diaspora unity. We are big, we are diverse, we are all over the world. I think what we need in order to unite is actually how we behave. I think we have to have values of respect, values of inclusiveness, and values of merit. If we have to do something, let's include everybody and find out the best person who can do it. It's not that I say, listen, let's go into a corner, and I would tell you that I'm doing everything and let's run. No, we have to include everybody, we have to show respect, and we have to insist on merit.
Thanks, Nee. I want to thank the panelists. I do want to take one up favor from as the moderator and remind you of something, but Ambassador Saunders forgot one short thing.
Right.
So I'm going to let her.
For SMEs in particular, access to financing, I know, is a big challenge. And so the tools that I mentioned earlier, there are training tools in there for access to financing. I've done 3 access to financing trainings with a Fortune 500 company and a Nigerian parastatal bank of industry, and that's the biggest challenge. So really take advantage of those training tools. And on food security, there are 239 million hungry people on the continent of Africa. They're not all just in non-democracy countries. So it is a universal problem across the board, whether you're a democracy or not.
Good. I want to thank the panelists again. I want to thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. And I want to remind you that before you leave, there are these cards. If you could fill them out, they're very helpful for planning. And also, there's a questionnaire that we would love you to also fill out. And there'll be someone at the back who will collect them. If you don't have a card, you can get a card at the back to be filled out. It's very important. And with that in mind, I think it's my pleasure and duty, I think, to invite the Congresswoman up to make her remarks and give us a send-off.
Well, before everyone leaves, I just want to ask you to give a round of applause to a wonderful panel. I appreciate all of you for your participation today, but not just your participation today, your participation every day over all of the years and the contributions that each and every one of you have made to U.S. Africa relations. So thank you very much for all that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to thank our audience for participating. I know people have come and gone, and some folks have stayed throughout. Thank you very much. And, you know, this was a very important day. I thought it was very substantive. I also want to give a round of applause to my staff that has worked tirelessly on putting this flawless event together. So thank you very much. And you know, these events, it's nice to come here, it's nice to sit and participate, but it's really about what happens the next day. Yeah. So we will look forward to working with all of you throughout the year. We have a lot of work to do in 2015, but numero uno on that agenda has got to be the reauthorization of AGOA. Thank you very much. See you next year.